Welcome back and thank you for the amazing feedback on part 1, which you should check out if you want to fully understand the historical context of the betrayal of the German Revolution, since we look at the development of the important political forces, their representatives, and how those relate to the development of capitalism. So in case you are confused about some names that I use here, you'll likely find an introduction of those organizations or personalities in the first part. So, los geht's. After the refusal of the sailors to be sent to their certain death by the High Command of the German Reich, the Kiel Uprising began on November 3, 1918, and it was the beginning of the end for the German monarchy. But there was something bigger at play here. It was the very stability of German capitalism. By now, the revolting workers and soldiers understood very well who they were sent to death for. According to a report that was sent to the naval headquarters, the sailors were singing, quote, "We struggle not for Germany's honor, we struggle only for millionaires." They were saluting another with, "Long live Liebknecht." All attempts to suppress the Kiel Uprising failed. The sailors disarmed their officers, armed themselves and raised the red flag on the ships and factories, freed their comrades from prison and occupied public buildings. Mass meetings composed of tens of thousands of people were held and sailors and workers' councils were formed, just like they had formed before the October Revolution in Russia. On November 4th, Kiel belonged to the councils. An increasing number of soldiers and workers showed their solidarity and joined, with many sailors leaving Kiel and carrying the uprising to all parts of the country. Virtually every town in Germany followed a similar pattern like the one in Kiel. The councils became the authority in the towns. In Hamburg, the biggest city in the north, a workers' and soldiers' council formed, and Paul Fröhlich of the International Communists of Germany led a group of armed soldiers to take over the daily paper Hamburger Echo to create an outlet for the council named Rote Fahne, Red Flag in English, which proclaimed, quote, "This is the beginning of the German Revolution, of the World Revolution. Hail the most powerful action of the World Revolution. Long live socialism. Long live the German Workers' Republic. Long live World Bolshevism." Within a few days, all major cities of the German Reich were under the control of revolutionary workers and soldiers' councils. It is really quite incredible how, within a short time, a revolutionary situation can unfold this quickly all over a country, shattering all the theories of many self-proclaimed Marxists about the seeming stability of capitalism and their shifting the question of revolution far into an indefinite future. Quote, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen," Lenin said in 1917. Even in conservative Bavaria, soldiers joined with the workers to occupy all strategic points, such as railroads, telephone offices, or government agencies. On November 8th, the People's Republic of Bavaria was formed, thus ending the Bismarckian system. For a long time, bourgeois historians refused to call this immense upheaval a revolution. They referred to it as a chaotic period, a period of disorder and mutiny. But what had happened was, in fact, a real revolution. The very fabric of the social and economic system was shattered and replaced with something else. The masses embraced the councils over monarchic and bourgeois institutions. What are those councils exactly, and why are they so important for workers' power? Karl Marx had written about them in his analysis of the Paris Commune. Quote, "The Commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at short terms. The majority of its members were naturally working men, or acknowledged representatives of the working class. The Commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. The councils were a more democratic alternative, not only to monarchy, but also to the parliamentary system. In contrast to bourgeois democracy, in which all economic power is in the hands of a small minority of capitalists, the councils were precisely an organ for democratic control of the economy by the workers themselves. They enabled millions of people to achieve an unprecedented degree of self-determination over their lives. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats were doing their best to ward off the revolution by pushing the Kaiser to abdicate. Friedrich Ebert told Prince Max, quote, "Unless the Kaiser abdicates, a revolution is inevitable. But I will have none of it. I hate it like sin." The revolution could no longer be defeated. It had to be stifled. But time was running out. People's power was being established everywhere. But the most important city had not fallen yet. In Berlin, the independent Social Democrats were arguing with the Spartakists and the revolutionary shop stewards about how to unleash the revolution in the most crucial city. The revolutionary left was in favor of a mass strike, but the meeting turned it down, chiefly by USPD leader Hugo Haase, who still believed in unity with the SPD. He smeared the Kiel uprising as an impulsive explosion. Berlin was the most crucial city because it was here where state repression was strongest. The police crushed a meeting to celebrate the anniversary of the Russian Revolution on November 7th and gained control of all important streets and public buildings. But Karl Liebknecht had enough of the waiting and discussing with the cowardly USPD leaders and issued a leaflet calling for revolution. He was supported by the revolutionary shop stewards, the Spartakists, and many USPD members, frustrated with the appeasement approach of its leadership. The military high command were confident that any uprising in Berlin could be broken up by troops. But that confidence was short-lived, as more and more soldiers joined the revolting crowds carrying red flags. Liebknecht led a group of soldiers to seize the imperial palace, and left independent Emil Eichhorn seized the police headquarters. On November 9th, 6 days after Kiel, the revolution had overtaken Berlin. The old ruling class was desperate, so Prince Max finally handed the chancellor position to Friedrich Ebert on November 9th. The SPD leadership tried its very best to show fake support to the uprising to slowly but surely suffocate it. For instance, their paper Vorwärts called for a general strike, 5 hours after it had already begun. Philipp Scheidemann was eating a meal in the Reichstag restaurant when deputies ran toward him, begging him to calm down the masses who were outside the Reichstag building. He also apparently learned that a few meters away, Liebknecht intended to proclaim a German Soviet Republic. He had to do something quickly to not hand the initiative to the revolutionaries. After he reluctantly went to the balcony, he looked at an angry crowd carrying rifles and red flags. He told them that the socialist Friedrich Ebert is now the chancellor, that socialism had won. But the crowd was still angry, so fearing that the Kaiser's abdication wasn't enough to calm the masses, he proclaimed, quote, "Long live the German Republic," and massive applause followed. Ebert wasn't happy at all with this move, yelling at him, quote, "You have no right to proclaim the Republic." Ebert didn't want the Republic, he wanted order, and he hoped for the monarchy to stay, even after Prince Max gave it up by abdicating. However, little would he know that Scheidemann had been just in time. A few meters away on the same November 9th, Karl Liebknecht, speaking at a rally in front of the Russian embassy, proclaimed the Republic himself. Quote, "Down with the Hohenzollerns! Long live the Social Republic of Germany! The day of liberty has dawned. I proclaim the Free Socialist Republic of all Germans. We extend our hand to them and ask them to complete the world revolution. Those of you who want the world revolution, raise your hands." And thousands of hands rose up. If the German Revolution's most prominent names are Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the counter-revolution bears the name of Friedrich Ebert and Gustav Noske. Gustav Noske was a party functionary that had become a prominent deputy, an enemy of proletarian internationalism. He had declared at the Reichstag during World War II that socialists were not, quote, "vagabonds without a fatherland." He had tried to convince the bourgeois parties to give the German workers good reasons to become soldiers and thus give their lives in the imperialist slaughter. Noske declared himself a supporter of Oswald Spengler's proto-fascist Prussian socialism. Hitler wrote about Noske in 1933, saying he is, quote, "an oak among these social democratic plants." When the news of the Kiel uprising reached the imperial government, Prince Max sent a reliable social democrat to calm the revolutionary fervor, and that man was Gustav Noske. Aside from a few politically conscious workers, the majority of the revolting masses were still confused about the various currents and what differentiates them. Another consequence of not constituting the Communist Party at an earlier point. Yes, the majority Social Democrats had supported the war, but now they were seemingly on their side. Maybe they had acknowledged their mistakes. Many striking workers were not socialists, and they did not yet differentiate between the parties calling themselves socialist. Many of them did not believe, or rather did not want to believe, that the SPD leadership was determined to defend the old system. Hence, the councils were not exclusively made up of revolutionary socialists. For instance, German sociologist Max Weber was part of the Workers' Council of Heidelberg, and he was pleasantly surprised that most members there were moderate liberals. Nonetheless, people were radicalizing quickly, and that process had to be reversed. Noske, a cunning and talented politician, eventually managed to sway the people to his side. He was so successful in doing so that the crowds proclaimed him governor of Kiel. Noske promised to meet the most urgent demands of the workers and soldiers of Kiel, such as pardons of mutineers in return for a more calm atmosphere. The next day, Noske called Berlin, saying he, quote, had only one hope, a voluntary return to order under social democratic leadership. Then the rebellion would collapse. Noske slowly but surely restored authority of the former officers and the police, and Prince Max was full of admiration for what Noske had accomplished at Kiel. Quote, the man has done superhuman things. Prince Max later wrote in his memoirs, quote, the fate of Germany depended on Ebert repeating his party comrades' achievement on a large scale, that is, rolling back the movement throughout the country. Appeasement through minor concessions and false promises. This trick was to be successful in undermining countless working-class movements in the coming decades all over the world. At the time, very few anticipated the tragedy that was about to ensue. It is reasonable to assume that not even the ruling classes themselves were confident they could turn things around. In the 7 days after November the 3rd, revolution was a certainty for much of the working class. The German monarchy had collapsed, and there was no parliament with any claim to power. The only organs with any authority were the workers' and soldiers' councils, and the new government in power called itself socialist. So it is no surprise that many regarded the revolution as completed. Unfortunately, it wasn't. For a revolution to be completed, toppling the old order is not enough. Establishing a new one is the other, in many ways, even harder part. But the masses who had managed to take over city after city had no cohesive plan for what to do with that power. The revolution had been largely spontaneous. It had no centralized leadership, but the counter-revolution did. Now, the trick of Noske in Kiel had to be repeated in many other places, and most crucially in Berlin, where the revolutionary movement had arrived on November 9th. Time was running out. As the new chancellor of a non-existing government, Friedrich Ebert planned to, quote, steer the revolution into orderly channels and defend the rule of law from anarchy. But these maneuvers were not enough to defeat the Marxists, because the workers' and soldiers' councils were still the main authority throughout the German Reich. They had to be won over, and so it was crucial for the MSPD to build a coalition with the USPD to form an executive based on the councils. The independents themselves had not full control over the councils, and so it was in the interests of the USPD right wing to form unity with the MSPD. Hugo Haase was especially interested in social democratic unity because power was shifting quickly to the left wing of the independents, led by Georg Ledebour and the Spartakists. The two parties wanted to meet as quickly as possible, but because Haase wasn't in Berlin that day, and because Haase was so crucial for the MSPD, this decisive meeting was postponed to the next day on November 10th. The destiny of the future of Germany was to be determined in this decisive battle on Sunday. The Spartakists and left independents made their own preparations, but when the meeting started, the revolutionaries found themselves in an unexpected situation. On the previous day, the right Social Democrats mobilized their whole party machine to build up their own councils made up of hand-picked leaders. The propaganda they deployed was clever. They exploited the utopian wish of many to see a united socialist leadership. So they had used their massive resources to put out thousands of leaflets calling for unity and demanding, quote, no fratricidal strife. On 5 p.m., 3,000 delegates of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, which had been elected on the same day, met in Circus Busch in Berlin. The Social Democrats made sure that the soldiers' delegates, where they had a bigger influence, came early and would be seated at the front rows, and the workers at the back on the balconies. The soldiers, who were not as well versed in politics, were given the notion that anyone who criticized the need for unity would be a wrecker and a saboteur. The procedure was a mess. Anytime someone from the left wing spoke, they were overshadowed by unity slogans. When Ebert spoke, he met the mood by calling for socialist unity. When Liebknecht spoke, the crowd shouted, quote, unity, unity, and even threatened him with their guns. But still, he maintained his stance just like he had done throughout his political life and warned the delegates that the Social Democrats, quote, are going along with the revolution today, but were its enemies the day before yesterday. The counter-revolution is already underway. It is already in action. It is already among us. But this was not enough. The majority got its way by their calls for parity. The calls for parity were unreasonable. The USPD had outnumbered the MSPD in the factories, so in order to elect a fair committee, the independents would have had to be represented by a majority of delegates. But with the calls for parity and with the crowds on their side, they managed to push through an executive composed of 12 soldiers' delegates, majority Social Democrats or people under their influence, and 12 workers' delegates, 6 from the MSPD and 6 from the USPD. A joint, quote, revolutionary government, unquote, was formed on November 10th, composed of 3 members from each of the 2 Social Democratic parties, Ebert, Scheidemann, and Landsberg from the MSPD, Haase, Dittmann, and Emil Barth from the USPD. The newly formed government was imbued with a revolutionary veneer, the naming inspired by the Russian Revolution, the, quote, Council of People's Commissars. It sounded just revolutionary enough, proclaiming Germany a socialist republic and declaring that all power lies with the councils. Of course, this government was everything but revolutionary. The chief aim of Haase and Dittmann, who were chosen from the USPD, was to reunite social democracy, not revolution. Liebknecht was offered a spot, but he refused, realizing that he would be held back by the non-revolutionary majority. And he was right to think that. Emil Barth, associated with the left wing of the independents, did not have the strength to do so. Linked with the so-called People's Commissars were expert advisors, who were usually members of the bourgeois parties, making sure the, quote, socialists, unquote, left untouched the state apparatus of the old empire. What this meant was shown within a few days when the ostensibly revolutionary government expelled the embassy of Russia. So, Friedrich Ebert was now Chancellor of the Reich and People's Commissar. He was now at the same time a leader of the revolutionary government and head of the old legal government. The right outmaneuvered the left on this decisive day. However, this defeat needs to be put in context. The right had more resources, a well-established party machine, and the imperial staff on their side. They had the support of the ruling classes both within and outside Germany. This is the challenge all socialist revolutionaries face. The revolutionary veneer of the counter-revolutionaries worked. They were able to fool the workers, for now at least. On the same day the so-called revolutionary government had formed, Marshal Hindenburg sent out a message that the decision has been made to collaborate with Chancellor Ebert to, quote, avert the spread of terrorist Bolshevism in Germany. This was the so-called Groener-Ebert Pact. Years later, when Quartermaster General of the German Army, Wilhelm Groener, had to defend himself against right-wing critics, he said, quote, the officer corps could only cooperate with a government which undertook the struggle against Bolshevism. Ebert had made up his mind on this. We made an alliance against Bolshevism. There existed no other party which had enough influence upon the masses to enable the re-establishment of a government power with the help of the army. The whole state apparatus remained thus intact. This is why Marx insisted in his writings about the Paris Commune that, quote, the precondition for every real people's revolution is not to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. The explanation of Social Democrat commentators that the MSPD was stuck in a dilemma and had no choice but to collaborate with the imperial forces is particularly funny. Already on the previous day, Ebert ordered all state officials to keep their posts. All personnel, including all the high functionaries of the imperial regime, remained in their positions. And, more importantly, the economic power of the bourgeoisie was left untouched. There were economic reforms that were promised, such as limiting the working day to 8 hours. However, those were necessary concessions to appease the striking workers in order to protect private property and undermine the Marxists' appeal. Only days later, representatives of the bourgeoisie signed a deal with the trade unions to form a so-called community of labor, to accept some of the workers' demands. Broué quotes one liberal commentator who would say that the agreement achieved one important thing, quote, it forms a strong bulwark against any attempt to overthrow our social system by violence. The German bourgeoisie used their capital, their media, their connections, and various other means to wage war against the revolutionaries, all with the help of the Social Democrats, of course. They created the Anti-Bolshevik Center with immense funding to print hundreds of thousands of leaflets, sometimes even calling for murder against the Spartakists and their Bolshevik terror, their chaos against the Jews and bloody Rosa. They then formed the more powerful Anti-Bolshevik League, who would openly call for the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and which had its own intelligence service, or as its founder would call it, a quote, active anti-communist counter-espionage organization. The funding for bourgeois media far overshadowed the funding for independent media, which was composed of the contributions of working people. Of course, the government agencies were dominated by counter-revolutionaries as well. Ebert appointed his son as the head of one such agency. The other important organ of class rule are the armed forces, and the High Command had still lots of it. They intended to use it against the armed workers. Because they feared a Bolshevization of Germany from the First General Congress of Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, which was to convene on December 16th, Ebert and General Groener ordered troops to Berlin on the 15th to prevent this gathering and to regain control of the capital. Groener told in a court years later that Ebert was in agreement with sending troops into Berlin to disarm the Spartakists. However, the discipline of their field army was breaking down. Many soldiers became swayed by the so-called Bolshevik agitators. Tired of the World War, they had enough of the military discipline. It wasn't clear to them what they were fighting for, and the coup attempt failed. Still, many were killed during that attempt, further radicalizing the workers of Berlin. Without a people's army, the people have nothing, Mao Zedong famously said a few years later. The revolutionary left, of course, understood this and called for the formation of a Red Guard, which was passed on November 12th by the executive branch of Berlin councils, but was dropped again after the pressure of the right wing. But there was one armed force the revolutionaries had, which was the security force that had been formed by Emil Eichhorn, who had seized the police headquarters in Berlin. With government forces leaving and Eichhorn controlling the police in Berlin, the ruling classes had to come up with something else. Using funding from big business, Prussian Social Democrat Minister of the Interior Otto Wels created the Republican Soldiers Corps. Among the corps recruiters was a man named Colin Ross, who was later a supporter of Hitler. They would soon clash with the revolutionaries, but they still weren't antagonistic enough. Yes, they were against the Spartakists, but many of them still wanted socialism and hated the old state. They would show themselves not reliable enough for Ebert and the High Command. A more vicious anti-communist right-wing force was needed. There were still thousands of soldiers who identified with the ruling class and the old state. On December 22nd, the Social Democrats in government agreed that Imperial General Georg Merker should organize a highly paid proto-fascist mercenary force called the Freikorps. The Freikorps, for those of you who don't know, were notorious for being connected to the Nazi Party some years later, with many of them joining the SA or SS. Many of the Nazi Party leaders were part of the Freikorps, such as Rudolf Höss or the later leader of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. It's almost funny when liberal commentators describe this period in German history as the time when the left irreparably split. I think it's fairly easy to argue that this was not a fight between the moderate left and the radical left. It was the right wing versus the left wing, capitalism versus socialism. The reactionary Freikorps were not fully ready yet to go in and murder communists. For now, the ruling class had to rely on these shaky government forces who were against the communists, but not with sufficient determination the ruling classes required. Those government forces were deployed on what people later called Ebert's Bloody Christmas. The People's Marine Division, who was stationed at the heart of Berlin's government buildings in the Imperial Palace, had been an issue of contention throughout the German Revolution. Like other sailors and soldiers, they too were at risk of joining the revolution. This was not something the government could afford, so they tried to disperse the sailors by withholding their pay. The sailors reacted by holding Social Democrat leader Otto Wels hostage on December 23rd until they received their pay. Ebert exploited this situation and ordered pro-government troops to storm the Schloss. However, many civilians sympathetic to the revolution joined the fight, and by midday, the sailors had won, with about 70 people killed. This was devastating for the Social Democrats, not only in terms of men lost, but now even the Social Democrat-dominated Berlin executive of the councils condemned the attack. Power was slipping away. They did not even have the manpower to stop thousands of revolutionaries to seize the paper forwards on that day. Even worse, now the independents resigned from the government out of fear of losing support in Berlin, which was now more and more isolating the Social Democrats. It seemed like the revolution regained the high point of November 9th and was close to seizing state power. But there was one problem. The Freikorps were ready, and they could exploit the great weakness of the revolutionary movement, its disorganization. On the 30th December of 1918, the Spartakists finally broke with the USPD and formed, together with the left radicals, the Communist Party of Germany. It was the first mass-based communist party outside the Soviet Union, and the Soviet leaders had great hopes for it. This was long overdue, according to Pierre Broué. The revolutionary situation was highly developed, but had suffered a great lack of one coherent plan and organization, which a genuinely communist party can provide, as seen in Russia a year earlier, and soon in China and in many other places around the world. The Spartacus League was not powerful enough to provide a disciplined base to the quickly growing ranks of revolutionary soldiers and workers. A large section of the masses on the streets still mostly associated the USPD with a genuine socialist force. Most of them were not quite aware of the contradictory trends within that party. The constitution of the KPD was happening amidst a situation of great revolutionary confusion. One of the main obstacles in the party formation came from the international communists, and specifically from Johann Knief, who was against uniting with the Spartakists because he hadn't forgotten how they didn't want to separate from the USPD. He believed the formation of a Bolshevik party was the right thing, but it shouldn't include Luxemburg and her supporters, who were alien to the Bolshevik spirit according to him. But the majority of the IKD decided for uniting with the Spartakists at a conference in mid-December. Within the Spartakists, there was also great disagreement about the party formation. Luxemburg and Jogiches were against forming an independent party at least until the next USPD Congress. But Luxemburg let herself be convinced by the international communist leader from the Soviet Union named Karl Radek, who carried the prestige of the October Revolution with him. After the independents rejected a call by Rosa Luxemburg for a special meeting following the Bloody Christmas, she had enough, and 112 delegates came together in Berlin to found the KPD in a 3-day conference over New Year's in the Festsaal of the Prussian Landtag in Berlin. 83 delegates came from the Spartacist League, and 29 from the International Communists of Germany. Karl Liebknecht held the opening speech with a hard tone. He criticized the, quote, mechanistic, unquote, conception which had guided the leadership until now, and condemned the, quote, failure to understand the supreme importance of mass action itself and overestimation of bureaucratic, parliamentary, and other activities. He continued, quote, we joined the USPD in order to drive forward through our efforts all those who could be driven, in order to make the best elements advance, and to unite them in order to win over the largest possible revolutionary forces, and to organize them in a single revolutionary proletarian party. It was a labor of Sisyphus. He called for an immediate break and the creation of a new party. Various names were discussed. Luxemburg wanted the name to be the Socialist Party, not the Communist Party, in order to salvage some spheres of unity between the parties of the Second International and the Bolsheviks. Her proposal was rejected. The name Communist Party of Germany, Spartacus, won out. Then Radek spoke and proclaimed, quote, German social democracy is dead. It was once the authority throughout the world. It now has no more authority. Then came the turn of Paul Levy, who would soon become the leader of the Communist Party after the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, and he would speak about a topic that would become a major issue for the communists. He declared, quote, the road to the victory of the proletariat can pass only over the corpse of the National Assembly. However, shortly afterward he added, quote, despite all that, we propose to you that we do not stand aside from the elections to the National Assembly. Luxemburg agreed with Levy. None of the delegates were under the illusion that socialism can be brought about by parliamentary means, as those supposed socialists of the Second International thought. It was about whether it would be productive or counterproductive to use the National Assembly as a platform to break illusions among workers. The MSPD had called for a Constituent National Assembly to be convened as soon as possible, while the USPD and the Spartacist League wanted socialism based on the existing structure of workers' and soldiers' councils. So there was a sort of a dual power situation in Germany at the end of 1918, with the councils still having a far more powerful base. But Ebert's role as Chancellor of Germany and as a leader of the Council of People's Representative reflected how the old SPD reformist institutions had still great influence in both structures competing for power. The majority of the delegates were unimpressed by the arguments put forth by those who wanted to participate in the National Assembly. Only 6 days earlier, they had witnessed the humiliations of Ebert's government to crush the sailors in Berlin. Otto Rühle insisted, quote, we have other tribunes. The street is the great tribune that we have conquered and that we will not abandon, even if they shoot at us. Elections were an unnecessary distraction, he explained, saying the communists are done with, quote, compromises and opportunism. In the end, the Congress accepted Rühle's counter-proposal to not take part in the elections. Luxemburg's position tracked with Lenin's at the time, to use the parliament as a platform, not as a vehicle for real change. However, it surely didn't mean that Luxemburg was a proponent of bourgeois democracy as today's social democrats and Euro-communists like to paint her. Luxemburg's legacy is constantly being opportunistically revised and demarcated from, quote, authoritarian, unquote, communism in order to salvage liberal democratic institutions. In 1918, Rosa Luxemburg wrote about the National Assembly, quote, "What is gained, then, with this cowardly detour called the National Assembly? The bourgeoisie's position is strengthened, the proletariat is weakened and confused by empty illusions. Time and energy are dissipated and lost in discussions between the wolf and the lamb. In a word, one plays into the hands of all those elements whose intent is to defraud the proletarian revolution of its socialist goals and to emasculate it into a bourgeois democratic revolution. The first decisive step in the Great French Revolution was taken in July 1789, when the three separate estates combined in a joint National Assembly. The decision left its stamp upon the whole future course of events. It was the symbol of the victory of a new bourgeois social order over the medieval feudal society of estates. In the same way, the symbol of the new socialist social order, born by the present proletarian revolution, the symbol of the class character of its true task, and of the class character of the political organ which is meant to execute this task, is the Workers' Council, based on representation of the urban and rural proletariat. The National Assembly is an outmoded legacy of bourgeois revolutions, an empty shell, a requisite for the time of petty bourgeois illusions of a united people, and of the liberty, equality, fraternity of the bourgeois state. To resort to the National Assembly today is consciously or unconsciously to turn the revolution back to the historical stage of bourgeois revolutions. Anyone advocating it is a secret agent of the bourgeoisie or an unconscious spokesman of petty bourgeois ideology. Another point of contention was whether communists should stay or leave the reformist unions. Paul Fröhlich proposed the slogan, "Out of the unions." Luxemburg disagreed with the slogan, but basically agreed to liquidate those unions. A great loss of the founding Congress was its failure to convince the revolutionary shop stewards to join the party. They were experienced fighters of the Berlin proletariat. Their addition would have been a great advantage. The birth of the Communist Party was a very conflicted one. Pierre Broué even comments, quote, "It was doomed to impotence before it had swung into action." However, on a more positive note, he then quotes Lenin, who wrote on January 12th, quote, "The foundation of a genuinely proletarian, genuinely internationalist, genuinely revolutionary Third International, the Communist International, became a fact when the German Spartacus League, with such world-known and world-famous leaders, with such staunch working-class champions as Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, and Franz Mehring, made a clean break with socialists like Scheidemann." Chris Harman and Broué's assessment was that the KPD had a clear left adventurist tendency, which was a major weakness according to them. But I think that such an assessment is easy to make from a point of view in a time where revolutionary energy is not right outside your house. Berlin was brewing with revolutionary fervor. The councils were the dominant political force and growing in power. So it was within that political climate where it was hard to have a clear-headed mid-stance between opportunism and adventurism without receiving accusations from both sides, something which Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht managed to do fairly well despite many mistakes. That doesn't mean that the accusation of impatience cannot be made. But I would argue that in a situation like that, it wasn't just about rejecting the young, radical, revolutionary fervor. It's about the right way of dealing with that energy. And if you extend the sphere of analysis to the 20s, and not just the uprisings that immediately followed, the young radicals did quite amazing in their organizational efforts. But converting revolutionary emotion to revolutionary organization is challenging when the Communist Party had just been founded, and without the accumulated strength and experience of both that revolutionary party and the history of revolutionary organization and theory we now have today. And that lack of long-term revolutionary preparation and experience was definitely lacking and couldn't sufficiently meet the explosive potential of the masses in the following year. At the beginning of 1919, it seemed like nothing could stop the rapidly growing influence of the revolutionary left in Berlin. The government's army was falling apart. The illusion of Ebert's fake revolutionary stance was collapsing. Even the independents had abandoned the Social Democrats. They could only watch helplessly as the strike wave was growing and how its paper was seized. Most importantly, the revolutionaries had influence over the two most crucial forces in Berlin, Eichhorn's security forces and the Marine Division. The situation was so dire, Ebert even considered abandoning the city. However, the generals told him to stay, and on January 4th they made their counter-move. They spread the information that Eichhorn had been dismissed as police chief to provoke a reaction. This reaction would then be used to justify the use of the Freikorps that were now ready to be used to crush the revolutionary left under the guise of merely trying to restore order. A trick deployed by the ruling class seen quite frequently to this day. It was now Noske's time as the newly appointed defense minister. Quote, "Somebody must be the bloodhound," he said. The plan to deploy the Freikorps was fully developed before any Spartacist uprising happened in Berlin. Social Democrat Ernst, who was appointed to become the successor of Eichhorn, told journalists later, quote, "We, through our preparations, forced the Spartakists to strike prematurely." Meanwhile, Eichhorn, of course, refused to leave his post. The Berlin executive of the Workers' and Soldiers' Council was the only body he would listen to. He said, quote, "I got my job from the revolution, and I shall give it up only to the revolution." If the Social Democrats were just concerned with removing Eichhorn, they could have easily done so as they had great influence in the executive. But they wanted something bigger. They wanted the death of the revolution. The response of the masses was greater than anyone had expected. Hundreds of thousands showed up. The organizers didn't want this to be a violent uprising. In fact, the Spartakists had decided the previous day that an uprising must not happen at all costs. Paul Levy wrote, quote, "The members of the leadership were unanimous. A government of the proletariat would not last more than a fortnight. It was necessary to avoid all slogans that might lead to the overthrow of the government at this point." The masses seized the buildings of Vorwärts and various railway stations, who were assisted by government provocateurs, according to Richard Müller. The communist leadership did not have the means to guide this massive onslaught. Amidst the chaos, the independents set up a, quote, "joint revolutionary committee along with the revolutionary shop stewards and Liebknecht, who supposedly represented the Spartakists. Two key leaders of the shop stewards, Richard Müller and Ernst Däumig, opposed any revolutionary action, just like the majority of the Spartakist leadership. They, just like Luxemburg, considered this move premature. However, the majority decided it was time. The surprising alliance between Ledebour and Liebknecht was decisive. The mass strike started out as a great success. Snipers were atop the Brandenburger Tor, the government's printing offices and various other public buildings were seized. It is estimated that 500,000 people answered the call for a general strike and overthrow Ebert's government. But there was a problem. The Revolutionary Committee wasn't really a representative of all the important revolutionary organizations. Liebknecht and Wilhelm Pieck, one of the leading figures of the Communist Party, had joined without informing the KPD. Luxemburg herself only learned about this a week later. This uprising went down in history as the Spartacist Uprising, despite the Spartakist leadership being against it. The Revolutionary Committee was way too large. It was organized more like a parliament instead of an executive. It could not make quick decisions. It was dominated by the independents, who were themselves very divided and indecisive. They were the most dangerous and unreliable allies for seizing power. In particular, it was unable to communicate to the hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating what actions they should take. So eventually they went home in the evening. On these 2 days, on January 6th and January 7th, they could have taken over the government according to Sebastian Haffner, but they failed. The consequences were catastrophic. One of the Spartacist leaders later wrote, quote, "What was seen on Monday in Berlin was probably the greatest proletarian demonstration in history. Proletarians were standing shoulder to shoulder. They had brought along their weapons and their red flags. They were ready to do anything, to give everything, even their lives. There was an army of 200,000, such as Ludendorff had never seen. Then the inconceivable happened. The masses were standing from 9 in the morning in the fog and the cold. Somewhere their leaders were sitting and conferring. The fog lifted and the masses were still standing. Their leaders conferred. Noon came, and in addition to the cold, hunger came, and the leaders conferred. The masses were feverish with excitement. They wanted one deed, even one word to calm their excitement. But nobody knew what to do, because the leaders were conferring. The fog came again, and with it the dusk. The masses went home sadly. They had wanted great things, but they had done nothing, because their leaders conferred. They sat the entire evening and the entire night and conferred. When dawn came, they were still conferring or were conferring again. The workers were prepared to cause a ruckus, but they were not prepared to take power, both ideologically and organizationally. What is needed is not just an uprising or causing chaos. What is needed is revolution, and an effective revolution needs a revolutionary organization. Many of the workers on the streets protested that the Social Democrats were disrupting socialist unity by sacking Eichhorn. Now they could shift the blame to the left as well. But all was not lost. The government was still on the losing side. However, the Revolutionary Committee was incapable of providing coordination to consolidate the gains. As Karl Marx said, quote, "The defensive is the death of any insurrection." That is the weakness of a spontaneous uprising. It is composed of people guided by anger, not organized anger. It will only succeed if the people are sure it'll succeed, which requires effective organization with a well-thought-out strategy and tactics, of course, because it's about defeating the old order and building a new one, not merely about seizing a few buildings. As soon as signs of defeat emerge, it falls apart, which is what happened. Luxemburg was against the uprising, but her position was that once the uprising was underway, at once it had revealed that it could overwhelm the government, it must be carried forward. Quote, act, courageously, consistently. That is the accursed duty and obligation of the revolutionary shop stewards and the sincere leaders of the USPD. Disarm the counter-revolution, arm the masses, occupy all positions of power, act quickly. But it was too late. The government forces had already gathered. They numbered 5,000, which was still less than what the revolutionaries had. But the bourgeois alliance had something the revolutionaries didn't: effective organization. The independents made things worse by trying to enter into negotiations, which gave the government time to assemble their forces. But these forces weren't good enough for Ebert and Noske, who wanted to wait for the more reliable Freikorps to be ready. On January 11th, they were ready, and they marched into Berlin. What followed would go down in history as one of the greatest tragedies in the revolutionary movement.